instead of using JavaScript, you're using C#, and you really don't need to do any of that goo of messing with DOM elements. It just sort of happens. So a page in Blazor is a routable component. All right, component. All right. Hi, I'm Carl Franklin. You know, just as a train knows how to get you from Los Angeles to New York, Blazor knows how to route your requests to the right component. In this episode of Blazor Train, we'll discover how these routes are established and how to navigate them. After a spectacular demo put together with skull-numbing genius, I welcome MVP Chris Sainty to discuss the internals of how we get from clicking a link to your Blazor page. That's all coming up right now, right here on Blazor Train. Blazor Train! All right, let's talk routing. So, what is a page anyway? Well, let's dial it back to the 90s, the early 90s, when the web was coming into being. A web page was an HTML file. Index.html, counter.html, contact.html. Remember those days? Well, maybe you don't. But then, for me anyway, the next thing was ASP and PHP, like these technologies that allowed us to write code and spit out HTML. But the browser still loaded an entire page. Then came web forms. We had some more interactivity at a scalability price, of course, but it was still loading an entire page. And then we learned to do things like AJAX calls, where we would call out to an API with JavaScript and just bring back some data and only update those parts of the page that needed updating. I don't know, it was really good. Blazor is a lot like that. There's one page, and instead of using JavaScript, you're using C#, and you really don't need to do any of that goo of messing with DOM elements. It just sort of happens. So a page in Blazor is a routable component. All right, everything is a component in Blazor, but this @page directive makes it routable. So what does that mean, routable? Well, that means when you enter a URL into the address bar, that Blazor figures out which components to load. Okay? How does it do that? Well, this isn't really a class, right? This isn't code that executes, but a class does get generated. Take a look over here in the Solution Explorer. I'm going to set the Show All Files toggle to true. I'm going to dig down into my debug.NET Core Razor Pages folder. And you can see every time I build, these things get recreated. And there's one right there for counter, counter.razor.g.cs. Now, if I, whoops, wrong one. If I pull that up, I'll scroll down here. Look at this. Here's a route attribute on our counter class. And that route attribute is critical, all right? That @page directive turns into a route attribute. And so how does the router figure that out? Reflection. Look at app.razor. The router first needs to know what assembly it's looking at. And then it's going to find all of the classes that have that route attribute, and it'll build a little table in memory that says, oh, this page, here are all the routes to it. And yes, I did say routes because we can have more than one. This page has these routes, etc. And then this area right here for when a route is found, a page is found, a component is found that matches that route, then we show it with a route view. Otherwise, we've got this, sorry, there's nothing at this address. Now, I did mention multiple routes. All we have is multiple page directives. Check it out. I'll add another one that's just count. And another one, yeehaw. Doesn't matter. You can have as many as you like. Let's run this and see what happens. Okay, here's my counter. I'll change this to count. No problem. Change it to yeehaw. Also, no problem. We can get there the same way. All right, now what happens when we navigate here on the left to our different pages? Well, what's not happening is that the whole entire page isn't reloading. And I can prove that to you. Let's go to our underscore host.cshtml. Now, I've talked about this before. This is sort of like where the first page that gets loaded, okay? This is your HTML template for everything. I'm just going to put a breakpoint here on the code, the one line of code, layout equals null. That executes when this loads. There it is. So the first time page executes, it loads, but not consecutive times. That's because these are just components, even though the URL changes, okay? The router intercepts those URL requests and routes us to a different routable component that just loads up on the page. It's brilliant, really. Now, before we leave underscore host, and I am obviously in a Blazor server app here, I'm going to turn pre-rendering off. And it'll become obvious a little bit later why I'm doing that. So let's go back to app.razor. What happens if I want to pull in a NuGet package, right, that has other routable components in it? A NuGet package that has pages, right? Routable components. How do I tell the router to look in those assemblies? Turns out there's an additional assemblies parameter, and I can set this to a new array of types. So up here you can see we're looking for a type of program and getting the assembly. I can just add whatever types I want right there, and Blazor will find them. All right, let's talk about route parameters. And rather than going back to our counter, let's create a new page. This will be a new Razor component. We're going to call it people. Now, it just so happens, I've already got the code written out because I don't want to waste your time. And in the code block, we've got this class person. And we've got an integer ID, property, a first name and a last name. And we've got a list of these persons called people list. And when the component gets initialized, we're creating a new people list and adding 2 people to it. ID 1, Isadora Jar. ID 2, Harry Chap. Okay. Now up in the markup, here's our @page people parameter directive. If the people list is not null, that means we have been initialized. We're showing some UI here. Just a little list looping through, showing the first name and last name in people list. No big whoop. We haven't added a parameter yet. We're just setting up a page. Okay. Now, because I don't have an icon down here, I have to type people. There it is. Let's actually add something to the nav menu so we can get here easily. I'll come back to the nav menu and discuss what all these things are, but for now, let's just copy the last one. And we're going to route to people. Text will be people. Oops. And we'll even change the open iconic icon to people. Turns out there is a people icon. Boom. There we go. All right, back to people. Let's add a route parameter. So now we've simply added another route they're both people, the prefix is people on both of them, but now we've added a parameter named last name. Now because I haven't specified the data type with a constraint, which we'll do, it's a string. All parameters are strings by default. So these are route parameters. How I access that is by creating a property with a parameter attribute of the same name, last name. Now we're going to use this to filter our list, and you can see that I'm now using another list called filtered people rather than people list. People list is going to have the entire list. Filtered people is going to be filtered this time by last name. So if that last name property is specified, I'm going to set filtered people to the subset where the last name contains that parameter. So I could type J to get Isadora Jar, I could type C or CH or CHA to get Harry Chap, etc. And this is how we specify /CH, for example. There you go. Now that's pretty cool. Well, let's add another one. Yeah, you can do that. You can add as many parameters as your heart desires. Now I've got two parameters. The first parameter is going to be a message, which I will, if we have a message, show in a div. And the second one will be last name, business as usual. The only difference here is I've added a message parameter, and if the message is there, I'm showing it. Everything else works the same. Okay. So here's our message, is the first parameter. I'm going to say hello. There it is. And the second parameter I'm going to use to filter for Harry Chap. Looks good? Great. Oh, by the way, what if we want to make our message a file name with a period? Boop! We don't like that. Blazor does not like periods, but here's a tip for you. The tip is we can allow periods if we go to _host.cshtml, and this is only in a Blazor server app. Okay, you can't do this in Blazor client side. But we can allow them if we add this asterisk path parameter to the page itself. Now my message could be check out readme.text, and everybody's happy. Okay. All right, now I told you that we could add parameters of different types other than strings. Let's do that. This is using parameter constraints. The constraint here is ID is a parameter, but it must be treated as an integer. Okay? If it's blah 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 string, then it's not going to match ID. In order to make this work, I want to make it nullable. So I have a parameter ID, which is a nullable integer. And now I can check it like I would check everything else. So we have our last name filter here, and if last name isn't specified, we check to see if ID is specified, and if it is, then we filter people list by the ID. Otherwise, we default to all people. Now, remember, ID is the first parameter. So I can say people/1 or people/2. What happens if I say people/3? Then I get nothing because there are no matches. And if I do something like that, oh, that's a message because that's the second the third route, right? Now I can also do the message and the last name, which I did before, hello/ch, and I can also do the message and an int ID. Very cool. All right, let's talk about the two ways we can navigate. We can navigate with HTML and we can navigate with code. So let's pull up index, and guess what? Anchors work just fine. I can create an anchor, href equals people/1, show the first person. All right, this is going to work just fine. There we go. And I can also use our good friend, the nav link. Now let's talk about the nav link. Why would you use a nav link other than an anchor? Well, you get a couple of nice features. You probably already noticed this behavior, but with the nav link, you get this sort of hover UI, right? Which as we hover over them, you get this nice little highlight. But also the active or the currently selected page is highlighted, right? And how this works is with a technique called attribute splatting. There's a class called active, and it actually gets injected, this attribute, into the class attribute when it's selected. Now let's take a look at the CSS. I know I never look at CSS, but this is important. So under WebRoot CSS, you've got your Open Iconic and Bootstrap things that are sort of for everything. And site.css is just for our Blazor template. So let's look in here. Here's our main, right? Here's our sidebar, and down to nav item anchor, and here's active. And it's basically got a background color over it with a 25% alpha channel or opacity. Hover only has a 10% opacity. Yep, that works. So this guy right there, this class is getting inserted in to the attribute, the class attribute, when it gets clicked. So that's the first thing it does. The second is you have the ability to change how the matching works, right? So yes, you have an href here, counter, fetch data people, and nothing. There's a match, nav link match enum that has two options, all and prefix. Prefix is the default. All right, but we need to match the entire URL right here, or the entire route actually, for home. For the other ones, we want to only match the prefix, counter, fetch data, people. All right, because look at people, for example. We've got 5 routes. This is the prefix. We only want to match that. Well, we want to match all of these based on that prefix. All right, so that's the difference there. Let's talk about navigating with code. We can inject a navigation manager, nav manager is what I've called it, and use that to navigate to particular routes. So in this case, when we click our button, we're going to call this code here to navigate to people/hello. And here's another one. We're going to navigate to people/1 to show the first person by the index. 2 different ways that we can access this page, and we can use the navigation manager to do it. All right, there's the first one. Here's the second one. Easy. Easy peasy. All right, now I've got another tip for you. First of all, let me tell you the problem. So let's take this second button here and go over to people and try to navigate to our own page from our own page, passing different parameters. Well, we need a nav manager first, so let's inject that. Okay, now we're going to see what happens when I try to navigate from inside my own page. What do you think's going to happen? Let's go to people. You see all of them. Now we're going to show the first one. I'm clicking. The URL is changing. However, it doesn't update. Why is that? Well, it's because all of the filtering happens on initialized. And remember, I wanted to turn pre-rendering off just so that on initialized doesn't happen every time. Turns out it wouldn't anyway, but it's cleaner that way. So on initialized happens the first time the page is loaded, but not when you just changed up the parameters. For that, we need to utilize the on parameters set. But first I'm going to show you another way that you can do it. The navigate to has a second parameter called force load. I don't know if you can see that there. Let's set that to true. It's false by default. Okay? So when I set that to true, the page gets reloaded, the oninitialized happens, and our filter gets applied. But I don't think this is a really good idea in this case, because I don't want to have to remember every time I navigate to a page to load it. Maybe I don't want to load it every time. In that case, I might want to use that Boolean. But here's a better solution. If I can spell. On parameters set. Now, on parameters set happens whenever those parameters change are on a navigation. Whether it comes from outside or inside, this happens on a navigation, not just the first time the page is loaded. Okay? All right, let's talk about query strings. Why? Why do we care about query strings? We've got this beautiful routing system in Blazor. Why do we care about people who put question mark this equals that in the URL? Well, backward compatibility. Let's say you're replacing a legacy system with a new Blazor system, and all of Google and Bing, all of the URLs that are out there are permalinks. Those people are expecting to get to your page with those query strings, and you may want to support them. So check this out. Blazor doesn't support query string parsing right out of the box, but there is this package here, microsoft.aspnetcore.webutilities, which is free, and you can load it up and install it. It's a NuGet package. So we're going to have to use that namespace, which you can put in your imports if you like. And now down here, we're going to, on parameters set, get the absolute URI from the navigation manager. And then we're going to use the web utilities query helper parse query method, passing in the query and trying to get the value for message, the name message. So if somebody says question mark message equals blah blah blah, then that will manifest itself in this variable right here, message, lowercase, which we populate our message parameter with. Here we go, question mark message equals hey now. And there it is. It works. All right, there's one more cool thing I want to show you before we get off the subject of routing, and that is how do we detect when a navigation is occurring. I want to get a hook. It turns out the navigation manager has an event that we can subscribe to. We can handle this event. The problem is we don't want to handle it and not unhandle it, because that means we'd be handling it twice, 3 times, 4 times, every time that page is loaded or the parameter is set wherever it is that we're hooking it. So we're going to have to know when the page goes out of scope so that we can unhook the event. How do we do that? iDisposable. The good old dispose pattern. So let us go to the top of this, and you can see we've got our @implements iDisposable. Now I'm using both the onParameters set and I'm using onInitialized. OnInitialized, I want to take our nav manager and handle the location event changed. The location changed event with a location changed handler. And when the page is getting disposed, or the component's getting disposed, I want to remove it. All right, there you go. Now what happens in this event handler is that we're looking at the navigation method and or is navigation intercepted, and determining whether we're navigating via HTML or code. And we're just showing that in our console. This is sort of the Blazor equivalent of console.writeline, systemdiagnostics.debug. So let's watch and see what happens as we go back and forth between HTML navigation and code navigation. And you want to be looking right down here in the lower left. And I'll zoom in for you. So this is navigation by code, right? And if I click on people over here, that is a navigation by HTML. And now if I go off of this page, the dispose kicks in, we unhook that handler, and all's good in the world. And that's all I got for routing, but there's more to come, so stick around. Back to you, Carl.
Ooh, I can just smell the engine room in your brain reaching unbearable temperatures.
Whoa, whoa!
But we're not done yet. My friend and fellow MVP Chris Sainty is here to tell us what's going on under the hood, starting from when we click on a link to the rendering of our Blazor pages. Chris, welcome to Blazor Train. Good to see you.
Hey, Carl, thanks for having me.
Yeah, great to have you here. I wanted you to talk to the peeps about the whole process of routing from clicking a link in the browser to actually routing on the page, because you did a great talk at .NET Conf, and I'd like you to replicate that goodness for my audience.
Yeah, sure, no problem. So let me just share my screen and we'll go through it.
All right, good.
Cool, lovely stuff. So we're going to talk through the process Blazor goes through from us clicking a hyperlink all the way through to how it loads the correct page component, or perhaps not. Perhaps it loads a not found template instead. So let's track this. So we'll start right at the beginning. We're going to start off with this imaginary hyperlink we have here, and we're going to pretend that we've just clicked it. So our journey is going to start off in the JavaScript world. So what actually happens here is when we click that link, the Blazor event delegator intercepts that click event. Now, the event delegator is kind of an interesting beast all on its own, but it really handles all of the eventing system in Blazor. But it has a special use case for navigation events. So it has a callback registered, and that comes from the navigation manager. Now, this isn't the same navigation manager that you're probably used to in your Blazor applications, okay? So there's a C# version of this, which is really cool, which is what you would use to do your programmatic navigation. So you probably injected that into components and stuff like that and called like navigate to.
Yep.
Yeah. So this one,
that.
Excellent stuff. Cool. So this one is its equivalent that sits in the JavaScript world. So this is handling all of the navigation stuff that works with the browser APIs and the lower level bits in JavaScript.
So this is intercepting any kind of navigation that the browser would normally handle.
Yeah, that's completely correct. Yeah. So what what it does is when it receives this event from the event, or when the event delegator invokes the callback that's registered, the navigation manager then goes off and does some checks. Okay, because there's a few things actually that you need to check when we're doing this stuff. Because what happens if the user's trying to open a new tab, for example, like they're holding down like the control key when they click the link, and stuff like this. So Blazor shouldn't intercept that stuff. So that's kind of why these extra checks are done. So the primary check it does is to check whether interception's even enabled. Now, this particular check is done because if Blazor's router hasn't been initialized, then there's really no point in the navigation manager trying to intercept the link in any way, because there's nothing further downstream to actually handle the event.
Oh, that's good.
Yeah, so it makes sense, really. So if for whatever reason the routers fail to initialize, or maybe you've written an app that you don't want to have routing in it, it's just a single page for whatever reason. And I mean that literally, not in the sense of a single page application. So you might not even have a router. So in that case, you don't want the navigation manager stopping anything happening.
Right.
The next check is the modifier key press. So that's pretty much what I referenced a second ago. If you're holding down control when you click a link to open it in a new tab, you don't want Blazor stopping you doing that.
Or Alt or Shift, right?
Or Alt or Shift, exactly.
Or probably Command on a Mac.
Yes, Command on a Mac. Yeah, so all those are checked as well by the navigation manager. The next check is kind of in a similar vein. It checks for a target attribute. So target attributes can be put on links, and they're like a programmatic way of us saying that this should open in a new window or some new target. So that's checked as well. And basically, as long as the target, if there's a target attribute present, as long as it doesn't have a value of _self, because _self essentially means open where you are, then again, that will get processed. That will get left alone. And then the final check is to see whether the route that we're actually trying to get to is even within the scope of the base URI for a Blazor application. Okay. So a quick refresh there. The base URI is defined either in the index.html of a Blazor WebAssembly app, or it's in the _host.cshtml file in a Blazor server app.
Yes.
And it's this little tag here.
Yes.
So this is actually nothing special to Blazor. This is actually just a normal HTML tag, but it's used by a lot of SPA applications because it's a way of knowing where the application sits in the URL scheme, I guess.
Yeah, that's right.
Describe it that way.
I didn't mention this in the demo today, but if you have a Blazor app or another application, and then you want a sub application of that application, your Blazor content would start at maybe, /Blazor, for example.
I've got you covered here, Carl.
Yeah, like look at that.
So exactly right. So in this example now, if we were trying to go to a link that was in what we've got on the screen here is contusostore.com/item/2, well, our base href is now set to /Blazor. So actually, the router would leave that link alone because it actually doesn't fall within the scope of the application.
Yeah.
It would only intercept links that began with /Blazor.
Nice.
So that's quite an important check. And that's also why you should always remember to have your base tag defined in your application. Otherwise, the router can get a bit funky if you're trying to do sub-applications.
Right. Very good.
So that's all good. So we've done our checks now. And basically, if they fail in any way, shape, or form, so interception's not enabled, if we've got a modifier key pressed, if there is a target attribute with a value of anything other than _self, or we're not within the scope of the base URI, then the event's going to be left alone, and that navigation event will continue on its normal path as if Blazor wasn't involved. So that will navigate however that needs to.
Right.
However, if all the checks are good, then a couple of things happen at that point. So the navigation manager is going to update the browser history, and it's also going to update the address bar. So this is going to give the real feel of an actual page navigation here, because obviously, we're in a single page application. We're not really moving anywhere.
Right.
But by doing this, it allows all of the normal browser functions to work as you'd expect. So the forward and back buttons, for example, will still work in a single page application framework like Blazor because of what this is doing.
Here's a question for you, Chris.
Oh, yeah,
What
go on. Yeah.
happens with search engine optimization? I know this is typically a problem with single page applications, but does the way that the routing works, does it allow does it allow a search engine like Google or Bing to reach in and actually find content?
So that's an interesting question, and I'd like to just say before I answer it, I am by no means an SEO expert. But essentially, where spas really struggle, and things like Google have got a lot better at dealing with JavaScript apps. But essentially, it's more to do with the rendering of the app. So if you don't have pre-rendering turned on, for example, on a Blazor WebAssembly app, what a search engine would see that doesn't understand JavaScript would basically be an empty app tag. If you think of the app tag, the default app tag that's in the index.html of a Blazor WebAssembly app.
So all that dynamic content isn't categorized.
It's not there. Yeah, exactly. It's not there. And the problem is if your navigation menu is inside there, which obviously in a Blazor app, it probably is. There's very little chance that it isn't. It doesn't see the link. So there's no way for it to crawl the site.
Yeah.
So actually pre-rendering is really the biggest thing for SEO, because then there's some content in that tag that the web crawler can then move around and find the various pages of your site. In terms of doing that, though, I don't know. Getting back to your question specifically, I don't know if any of this really actually matters too much. As far as I'm aware, the crawlers effectively just find a link and then go to it, and then find the next one and go to it, and just keep doing that and sprawling out. But it probably can't hurt. Let's put it that way.
Right. Sure. Okay. Where were we?
Cool. So we've updated the browser history. We've updated the address bar. So the last thing we're going to do while we're in the JavaScript side of things is we're going to call a function called notify location changed. So what this notify location changed function does is it actually invokes a callback that's registered when either the Blazor server or Blazor WebAssembly app boots up. And that's done in either the Blazor WebAssembly.js file or the Blazor server.js file. Mm-hmm. And what that does is it registers a callback here, and it says, and that callback does like the reverse interop, so it calls back into C#. So this is going to make this is the point we cross the divide from JavaScript to C#.
Right, and if it's Blazor server, we're going to go through SignalR, and if it's Blazor WASM, we're just going from one process to another.
Yeah,
right?
Exactly that. So in Blazor server, we go over that SignalR connection. We go back to the hub back on the server. And then from there, we invoke a certain method, which is on, I forget the name of it now. It's called the remote navigation manager.
Okay.
So while we work with a navigation manager day to day as consumers of Blazor, the navigation manager class is actually abstract. It has two specific implementations. So there is a WebAssembly navigation manager and a remote navigation manager.
Nice.
And we call into a specific one, depending on obviously whether we're using Blazor server or Blazor WebAssembly.
Excellent.
So we're now in C#, okay? And we're now, what we're doing is we're now going to hit the navigation manager that we're used to in C#. Mm-hmm. So what happens is the navigation manager's URI property gets updated with the new route that we're navigating to. So whatever we've updated the address bar in the JavaScript world, that's what the URI property gets updated to in the navigation manager.
Okay.
And then after that, we raise an event called location change. Now that probably sounds familiar at this point.
Yeah, we just showed, let me say that again. Yeah, I just showed how to hook that and how to release it with iDisposable.
That's it. Yeah, precisely. So that's the exact event that gets invoked by this whole process. Now we can hook onto that event ourselves, as you've just demonstrated, which is great. But the key thing that hooks onto that event is Blazor's router component.
Yeah.
So we hit the router component. At this point, it's listening for that location changed event to be invoked. And now it starts its process of trying to load a component to handle that route. So
Fantastic.
the first thing it's going to do is check a routing table. So when Blazor's router actually initializes, when your app first boots up, it's going to use some reflection to scan either the assembly it's in or other assemblies, because we can pass lots of different assemblies that we want it to scan.
Yep.
So it's going to do that, and it's going to look for any components that contain a root attribute. Now, the root attribute is comes from the page attribute, or the page directive, sorry, that we apply. So once it finds one of those, it records a couple of bits of information. It records the type of that component, and it also records the root template that's defined for that component.
Yeah.
And it stores all of that in this routing table. So when this event's fired in Navigation Manager, it checks that routing table for a component that matches that route. So it does that by breaking the route down into segments and checking each segment and checking for parameter values and all this kind of cool stuff. But essentially, that's what it's doing. And at that point, it's literally a binary decision. From there, we either find a match, which is great, and we load the page component that matches that route, which is awesome. Yeah, through the route view, exactly right. And that's it. And now at that point, we now have that new page loaded, and we've moved to our new page, and the process is complete.
That is awesome.
Yeah,
From
it's pretty cool. It's amazing.
render.
It's amazing what happens just from a simple link click.
Yeah, right. Fantastic. Well, Chris, thank you very much. I did a pretty good job of explaining the practical information of how to program with the router and how to understand what's going on, but I really appreciate your extra insight in showing how we get from click to render. So thanks again.
Absolutely, my pleasure.
All right, we'll see you. So now you know all about routing in Blazor. Hey, in the next episode of Blazor Trained, we're going to talk about the life cycle of a Blazor component and all the little places you can hook it along the way. Well, thanks for riding the rails with me today. This is where I jump off. I'll see you next time.
Blazor Trained.